Welcome to Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer. I'm Dr. Greer, and I'd like to thank the World Puja Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks to discuss a number of interesting subjects. And we have a great show lined up today that many people have asked us to clarify. And I'm joined by Linda Willitts, who's worked with us for more than 12 years, 13 years, helping us with the CSETI project and the Disclosure Project, and has done such wonderful things to move everything forward. Thank you, Linda, for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. You just returned from the conference, the European Exopolitics Conference in Barcelona, so I know that you wanted to report on what went down at that conference.
Yes, it was a really interesting gathering. We had, they think around 1,000 people there, and there were speakers from all over the United States and the world who were represented. And I gave 2 keynote addresses, which are actually on the web that people can listen to. And one of the things that keeps coming up in the context of these sort of events is this whole question of, are some of these extraterrestrial civilizations, maybe just a few of them, hostile or do not have the best interest of the Earth and humanity in mind. And this is, of course, the foundation for much controversy within the whole UFO subculture. And I think it's something that came up very strongly at this conference, really outside the formal conference, but it came up in the course of the conference. And we'll talk about some of the things that happened there. And I think that one of the things that I've always wanted to emphasize to people is that in my briefings with very high-level people in the governments of the United States and others around the world, I have never seen anything to indicate that we're under any kind of hostile invasion or anything that can be construed as hostility from these visitors. What I think has happened is that there's been a lot of things that have occurred where there have been misunderstandings of different types of phenomena or different types of experiences. And I think that's something we want to talk about today. For example, many people have had experiences with man-made pseudo-aliens, we call them programmed life forms, that are man-made in their entirety, that look like aliens, and they're not. And we have known about this. I have known about it since the early 90s, but they've been in existence for many, many years before that. And these have been used in conjunction with things that look like, quote, flying saucers or alien reproduction vehicles is what they're called in the biz, in sort of the aerospace industry, electromagnetic devices. And these have been used in a number of programs to create a psychological counterintelligence effort to create fear and have created the worldwide phenomenon known as the abduction phenomenon. And I think that many people don't understand the extent to which there's a huge confusion between the actual interstellar civilizations visiting here and the dominant, shall we call it, shadow alien activities. And those shadow alien activities actually are the dominant ones that are reported, and therefore causes enormous amounts of confusion. I think in addition to that, and this is why in 1990, I believe it was 6, way back, a long time ago, I wrote a paper on extraterrestrials and the new cosmology, where I discuss the whole concept of what kinds of manifestations of intelligence you might see from an interstellar civilization. This certainly isn't going to be moving around like a rocket or something like that, but also the technologies interface with consciousness. But beyond that, there are many other things that people experience. Some would call these ultra-terrestrials as opposed to extraterrestrials, things from the spirit world, such as poltergeist or angelic beings, or on the other end of the spectrum, demonic beings that are rather frightening. And many of these things, basically anything that's gone bump in the night, if anyone who's ever looked at the X-Files program, will know that these things have all been thrown into a sort of a catch-all term of, quote, aliens. But the problem with that is that they're very, very different phenomena because, as Monsignor Balducci at the Vatican pointed out, angels don't need flying saucers, and for that matter, neither do demons. And I think that we have a question where many people think that just because it's something weird that they've experienced, because we're in the space age, it's extraterrestrial. Well, it isn't. And there are many different experiences people have that have now made its way into the mythology of the UFO folklore as being extraterrestrial when it is not. Now, I think that this is really compounded by the fact that back in 1953, the CIA determined that this whole issue would be a wonderful source for, quote, and I'm quoting from the document, psychological warfare programs. And that's exactly what they proceeded to do. And in other documents even described engaging Hollywood to make films that would present the whole subject in a certain way. And there are two directions that the intelligence community wanted the whole extraterrestrial issue to be presented. One would be sort of a fantasy-driven, silly way that would kind of ridicule it, kind of cartoonish, and the other would be very frightening, such as the movie Independence Day, where, of course, Will Smith famously said, "Let's kick alien butt," and, the whole thing of uniting the whole world around a threat from outer space. Now, we have learned, of course, from no less a figure than Wernher von Braun, who was the core of the space program in the United States, and also was Wernher von Braun, as many people know, invented the V-2 rocket for Hitler. His spokeswoman for the last several years of his life has confirmed what I've heard from many other people, including recently a colonel who had worked with Ronald Reagan when Ronald Reagan was president, regarding the SDI, or Star Wars Initiative, and that is that there was a deliberate attempt to demonize the UFO subject and the extraterrestrial presence so that people would accept the cost of interplanetary conflict, and that this was all part of a psychological conditioning program, and that they would manufacture this, quote, threat from outer space when, in fact, none exists. So I think that people have to proceed extremely cautiously into this area because you have a subject that's actually had hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of funding that has gone into all kinds of counterintelligence and psychological warfare programs that are designed very specifically to frighten people. And these programs are very, very sophisticated. Unfortunately, it's not just informational like through Hollywood. It's also operational, and I think that's what we need to talk about a little bit, and that is these operational programs that masquerade as quote-unquote alien but are not extraterrestrial. And this is an area of great controversy, and it really is the third rail of the UFO subject. And I think for that I need to go back to a conversation I had with a man named Martin Cannon, who back in the 1980s, this was over 20 years ago, had put together a very exhaustive, I think about 2,000 footnotes, research library on a sort of paramilitary human involvement with what the public were calling abductions and mutilations and things of this sort. And he had found and confirmed that that was being launched by humans as a psychological warfare program using very, very sophisticated technologies. Well, he had his home broken into, his computer hacked into, all of his files taken, and he was blacklisted from every New Age and UFO conference because he dare speak the truth. And I think that this heroic man who I spoke to, he said, Dr. Greer, if you expose this, you're pulling back the curtain on really the big secret and the big lie and the big hoax that's out there, because they're desperately wanting people to believe in the good alien, bad alien Manichean view of this so that people will, down the road, and now it's not down the road that far, this is 20 years later, will accept the costs of an interplanetary conflict. And I said, yes, well, I was aware that this was the long-term agenda of the so-called Majestic Group, the group that had kept this secret since the 40s, and because we had documents to this effect, but also that we had witnesses who were brought to Washington to brief members of Congress that I organized in 1997, and one of whom had been on a committee, an interagency, all the three-letter agency committees, where he had been told very specifically that they had these extraordinary vehicles that are anti-gravity vehicles that are man-made by Lockheed, Skunk Works, and Northrop and other companies, and also these creatures, which have been dubbed program life forms. These things look like ETs, but they're man-made, completely man-made items, and that these were going to be used in eventually a program to hoax a false flag attack on the planet, because by doing so, the military-industrial controllers would be able to reconstitute and actually expand global control, sort of a military junta that would be over the entire planet instead of just over the United States and the United Kingdom and a few other places, and that it would expand the funding for weaponizing space and creating this sort of fear. And remember, and of course, they all have understood that humans, having sort of a midbrain that has a fight or flight response, respond very heavily to negative and respond very heavily to fear and anything that's a threat to their survival, because we're wired to survive. And that by using these sorts of images, but also engaging operationally in a paramilitary human-initiated abduction program where there are actually abduction squads, and I've interviewed men who have been on these squads that use extremely well-developed stagecraft, up to and including psychotronics and radionics, which are a type of electromagnetic systems that affect consciousness, various chemicals to induce an unconscious state, these alien reproduction vehicles, and then these strange-looking creatures that move around that look like a sort of a gray, some would call them a classic gray or a classic reptile creature. And, of course, many of these are not what they appear to be, if not most. And I think that this has also happened worldwide. I was just in Spain and met with the most renowned long-term researcher of this subject in Spain, who strangely was not speaking at the conference, but who was there at the conference, and a very nice older gentleman. And he said, but he was in Argentina years ago and met a man in the intelligence community. He gave me the man's name, but I'm not going to mention it here, who had set up the psychotronics and the abduction squads in Argentina. And he asked me if I thought that was surprising, that it would be in other developing countries as well as in the United States and the UK. I said, no, not at all. I know it's a worldwide effort to create the specter of a threat from outer space, because how else can you create a database, albeit a false and hoax database, of an evil alien presence that the world needs to unite around and fight? Now, this is, of course, exactly what Douglas MacArthur, in his last address to Congress, sitting in Congress, said. He said World War III will be interplanetary, and that there was an intent determined way back in at least the 50s to take this subject, create a psychological nexus of fear, that's sort of the ultimate false flag operation. Forget 9/11. This would be on a cosmic scale, and to control, the 6 or 7 billion people on the planet through that fear. And the kinds of programs and technologies that have been developed over the last 60 years using virtually a limitless supply of money are really quite impressive, rather depressing, but rather impressive. And subsequent to this, I have actually interviewed people who have worked in the deep underground Dulce facility that has an underground connector to Los Alamos, as well as people who worked out near in the Nellis Range, before what pop culture called Area 51, although it's not exactly what it's called. It's Area Pahut Mesa and S4 and S12 and S9, that they have actually worked in the programs underground where they have been building these alien-looking creatures. Now, recently there have been some witnesses who come out who were in these programs who worked or saw these creatures in these facilities, and they said, well, there are these strange aliens that they thought were extraterrestrial working with a classified project, and they didn't understand that those were man-made program life forms, PLS, that are both genetically engineered as well as have integrated circuits and computerized programs in their neural cortex. And these are not extraterrestrial, they are not interstellar, and it is a very well-developed program. Unfortunately, everyone talks about, even James Defense Weekly, Nick Cook and others, and in his book, I believe he called it the Race to Zero Point or Hunt for Zero Point, that there were all these studies going on in the 40s and 50s and even before that into anti-gravity and really advanced propulsion systems. What was forgotten is that an equal amount of effort has gone into the genetic programs and into the really sort of brave new world scary stuff that are I would say these programs are the spiritual descendants of Mengele and other, Dr. Mengele and others who created were trying to create a sort of really bizarre medical and genetic experiments during the Nazi era in Germany. And I think that from interviewing all these people, not just one source, but multiple sources, that there are very advanced programs dealing with these genetics and dealing with these biological program life forms, which have been then used with the anti-gravity devices and the psychotronics and certain chemicals, a la the famous MK Ultra program that people can Google, that are mind-altering, to give people different experiences. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who's had contact with an extraterrestrial appearing life form has been the victim of a man-made pseudo-abduction or man-made pseudo-alien encounter. But I think the dominant cases that you hear about are those. And this is a very difficult thing to bring up because I had Dr. Brian O'Leary, the Apollo astronaut, first time I heard him speak, he said, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And I think that people get very upset when they hear this, and they have been upset with me for discussing it. And I was warned of that. I mean, Martin Cannon was very clear. He said, if you talk about this, you're going to be touching the third rail of this subject, and it will cause people to really, really despise what you're doing because they have such an attachment to a Manichaean worldview of us versus them, sort of a cowboys and Indians in space mindset. And this is part of our evolutionary development, our tribalistic and ethnic development. And, of course, it's what's led to, on this planet, racism and genocide and the Holocaust and Rwanda and Darfur. And now what we're seeing is this juggernaut to try to demonize certain species of extraterrestrial civilizations and to create sort of a cosmic level of this racism. And I think we have to be very careful about this and not take the bait. I think that the population of the Earth are very vulnerable to this kind of deceptive effort. And in fact, my military advisor has a term for this that he learned when he was in top secret programs in the Pentagon, and it is called a deceptive indication and warning, or INW, or a false INW. The pop culture, we call it a false flag operation. And it's where something is created for a certain psychological intent so that certain policies can be crammed down the public's throat and the masses will accept it. Well, the really big one that's been worked on for 60 years is the creation of a threat from outer space. I'm convinced there is not one. Now, you cannot prove a negative. One of the things I always say is that when people say, can you prove that there are no threats from outer space? And I have to say, well, you can't prove a negative. It's axiomatic that can't be done. What we can prove is that the Earth hasn't been invaded by these civilizations. They are very concerned with our hostility. Witness all the Disclosure Project witnesses about the missile silos, nuclear weapon silos being examined, and at times even being rendered non-launchable, so that they were sending a message, please don't blow up this beautiful planet in a massive nuclear holocaust. And I think that what we have seen is that they have some great concern about a civilization or species such as Homo sapiens going from, horse and buggies in 100 years to space travel with thermonuclear weapons, and in the classified world, even more dangerous weapons than thermonuclear weapons. And I think that one of the problems that I see with this whole discussion that often comes up in these circles, and it's particularly rife in the New Age and UFO community, of a belief that, well, since there's so many people on the Earth who are troublesome, there have got to be civilizations out there that are like this. The problem with that anthropocentric projection is that in reality, you're not allowed to leave your star system when you are still at that state of evolution. In other words, a sort of quarantine has existed around the Earth, and Neil Armstrong was overheard famously, and this is reported in Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret, saying that basically we were warned off of the moon. There were a lot of ET craft that were there that did not want us going out into space as part of a Cold War space race, which is what the Apollo mission really was. It was a proxy for the competition with the Soviet Union, and we'd fallen behind during the Sputnik era. And what they wanted was clearly to have a civilization on Earth that would be peaceful and united going out into space. And that's what they're waiting for. They're waiting for us to reach that stage of peaceful function, at which point I predict the universe will throw open its arms quite wide and embrace us. Until then, we are under a type of quarantine. And I have had people with the National Reconnaissance Office and the Defense Intelligence Agency tell me things that have been done that have kept us from going and doing things out in space as much as we would like, because we're not viewed as a responsible member of planetary societies, that we are still engaged very much in the past 100 years alone. 160 million at least humans have been slaughtered in warfare on this planet. I mean, there are some planets where that would be the entire population of a planet that we have murdered in warfare. And we're not talking other murders. We're just talking organized state warfare and state murder, war. So this is something which is a very deep look at perhaps how we might be viewed by other civilizations. But if that policy applies here, it certainly is going to apply to other worlds and other star systems, so that certainly there could be intelligent life around other star systems that would have a similar level of dysfunction as we've seen on Earth in the last few thousand years with organized warfare and what have you. The likelihood that they're going to be allowed to develop technologies to leave their solar system and just go sort of free agent, willy-nilly out amongst the universe to victimize other planets is, I think, exactly almost zero. I think it's very unlikely that would be allowed because, as I understand it, there is a universal order. There is a interstellar order that would have a very clear policy preventing such an event, because that's what's happened here, where humans have not been allowed to go through space as extensively as we could, certainly within our classified projects. Ben Rich of Lockheed Skunk Works said that we already had the means to travel among the stars and that we could take ET home. But we're not doing so. And the reason we're not is because we're not at the point of evolution as a civilization, as an entire planet, where we're living peacefully and have vowed to only go out in space in peace. And I think that this is a universal directive, if I can call it that, or a policy. And I think, therefore, the likelihood that there are hostile civilizations that are allowed to just go around and do whatever they want on a planet like Earth that's an emerging civilization is extremely unlikely. Now, I can't prove a negative. You cannot, prove a negative, but all the evidence points to other things going on. Because when you look at the actual ET cases, where they have great concern for human hostility and warfare and nuclear weapons, that is more about us than them. It's sort of like a big cosmic mirror being held up to us. When you look at much of the information we've gotten on abductions and implants, and by the way, the implants are made by a company, I know the company and where it's located, that makes the implants that have been put into people. And then you have the anti-gravity devices that look like a flying saucer, and to any casual observer, they would think they would have seen something extraterrestrial, but it's not. It's completely man-made. And the most interesting, of course, are these creatures. And I've had multiple people. If it was just one person who said they had worked within these projects, creating or maintaining or managing these programmed life forms that look like, quote, aliens, I would have dismissed it. But it's at least a dozen people all over the world who have been inside these projects. Now, this is why there's a lot of confusion right now, because there are certain people who come forward who've been in those projects, but these projects are highly compartmentalized, and they didn't know that these creatures were man-made. They just knew they were running around and doing stuff. So the question becomes, when you have a highly compartmented project, you have to go deeper and deeper to find out what the source and origin of any given being is or experience is, because what you find when you begin to pull back all the layers of this is that you hit 38 layers and you're still digging, and you find you have 100 more to go. And that's what I've discovered over the last 19 years of working in this area. And this is a very, very complex question, because if enough stagecraft, as it's called, can be created, and enough people can be deceived to conclude that there is at least one or two extraterrestrial civilizations that are a threat, that will justify weaponizing space in the minds of the militarists and the minds of, frankly, the warmongers and the war profiteers who profiteer from conflict. So I think that, this is unfortunately something that has to be calculated into the worldview and the dominant, I have to say, the dominant myth that's in the UFO and New Age community, which is, there's nothing New Age about it. It's the oldest story in the book of people dividing into camps and engaging in this sort of divisive view that there are the good aliens that we should ally with and the bad ones that we should, not, and that there is this, very dramatic basis for a conflict. I don't see that actually existing, and I think that we have to be very careful we don't go there in an unwarranted way. And I think that people have had a lot of false information given to them unwittingly by people who, take things at face value. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with a multi-hundred billion, if not multi-trillion dollar disinformation campaign that humans have had now since the 1940s and 50s, you cannot take anything at face value. You have to question everything. And that's why I would tell people to be very cautious about reaching these fearsome conclusions about things that are not as obvious as one might think they are.
I think another thing that convinces many people that these abductions are really happening is the seemingly magical technologies that the aliens use to, say, for example, take someone from their bed in their dream state and they go right out through the walls of their house and they come back with scoop marks on their body and things. And you've personally experienced this astral body extraction technology.
Yes, I actually did, and it was interesting because I was later briefed on a program that's very human that has technologies to do this. And I think that the famous case in New York City where Paris de Cuellar was abducted out of his limousine and a witness was abducted out of her bedroom with him, I've had confirmed to me from multiple sources was a covert pseudo-abduction, pseudo-contact case that was designed to stop Paris de Cuellar and the people he was working with at the time from disclosing the actual fact that there have been secret programs dealing with extraterrestrials. They thought they were actually abducted by aliens. And it turns out the electronics to do this were developed back in the 40s and 50s. And that by 1956, these technologies were fully operational. And so I think that one of the problems is that many people don't realize the extent to which sort of how can you say it, a mad scientist, sort of Dr. Strangelove characters have developed very advanced electronics, what are called WSFM, Weird Science and Frickin' Magic. Literally, it's what it's called in the business, that are trans-dimensional technologies that humans have had since the 40s and 50s at least. I mean, remember the Philadelphia experiment, which actually happened in Rhode Island, but that's another discussion, was in 1942, and that did happen. So the question, really you have to back the whole thing up and ask, what the heck is going on? And I think that, it's to begin to develop sweeping and highly prejudicial views towards a certain type of extraterrestrial when we know that there has been so much deliberate confusing of the picture using extremely advanced technologies, things that most people couldn't imagine exist, because really the truth is stranger than the fiction that is the common dominant belief system. The fact that there would be human programs that would have these types of electronics that literally can target people and affect their astral bodies and consciousness very, very precisely. The fact that there would be these weird program life forms used on anti-gravity devices to engage in abductions to make it look like people are having alien encounters when they are not. The fact that they have developed genetics to such an extent that this would be possible. And the fact that at least a few people I've spoken to who have been in some of the really top secret electromagnetic research programs that deal with these trans-dimensional technologies, they've developed the means for people to hook themselves up mentally to a actual device and go into a lower astral realm, you may call it a demonic, but where there's all kinds of scary creatures, and then materialize in the three-dimensional space-time that creature and literally manifest it. And when I first heard that, I laughed and thought this is something out of a science fiction movie. Turns out that ability does exist. So you go down this path and you begin to realize that between the actual naturally occurring ultra-terrestrials, the sort of astral world, the angelic and the demonic, and then on top of it you have the man-made guys, the Dr. Strangeloves out there playing around with these electronics, doing this stuff, and then you have a very deliberate attempt to create, as Douglas MacArthur said, a threat from outer space and the foundation of fear so people will support World War III, quote, interplanetary war, is what he said. So I think that all of this makes one want to take a pause and step back, 4 or 5 big steps back and say, what is really going on here? And that's what I tried to do. Now, in the course of doing that, I've been personally demonized. In fact, during the Barcelona event, there was a person who organized a group of people who on the very last day stormed the stage, called me the Antichrist, and viciously, security had to move them out of the building. But what's happening is that it's sort of like with this healthcare debate where there's the big insurance industry whipping not everyone, but a lot of people up in a frenzy that big government's going to take away their health care, their private health care, and they're going to have to help provide insurance for the 50 million people who have no insurance in America. And, people are getting into this frothy mob mentality. Well, that's what's happened, unfortunately, in the UFO and New Age community, to the point now that I am receiving regular death threats. I am receiving these sort of attacks personally, and physical attacks when I'm on a stage, where I have to have now security with me because of this kind of disruptive behavior. And this is precisely what the majestic, the secret government people would like to see happen, is to see people who know about the subject get into that kind of what I call hate frenzy, which is exactly the kind of mob mentality you need in order to get the citizenry whipped up and angry enough to accept eventually some kind of sacrifice in the future. In this case, the sacrifice that they're going to ask people to make to engage in interplanetary war. And I think that we have to have calmer heads prevail. We need to have people who look at this and say, you know, who is manipulating the public awareness and emotions to such an extent that someone would, at this beautiful conference, storm the stage and attack me like this? And what are the interests that would like to see people have something new to hate? You know, it's really not politically correct to be openly a racist against any particular race or religion or ethnic group, although it certainly still happens all over the world. It's not something that's acceptable any longer in our society, thank God. However, the new thing that is acceptable is to become a cosmic racist and to begin to hate people from other star systems that are of a certain body type or a certain look a certain way. And I think people are just being manipulated. I honestly don't think that there's a threat out there. And one of the things that I have concluded a long time ago, since you cannot prove a negative, and it's axiomatic, as I mentioned earlier, is that if there was a species that was of some concern, that did not have the best interest of humanity or the Earth in mind, I would think that since CSETI's CE5 initiative is a diplomatic outreach effort, citizens' diplomatic outreach effort, that we're modeling for other countries as well, for the world. And there's now a major G7 country that is asking us to do this for them, to make open contact with these visitors. I would say that if someone really believes that there is not an ultra-terrestrial, not a man-made PLF, not a hoaxed event, but an actual extraterrestrial species that are hostile to us or who are doing things that are harmful to the human future, those are the ones I would want to meet with first. I think you need a diplomatic, calm minds and a diplomatic approach to Iran and North Korea more than you do to Canada. I think that if you're sincere about peace, and I think that the big challenge of our time isn't just world peace, it is universal peace, that you have to look at this and say, if there was such a threat, we would really want to have the same approach that we're using now, and that is we go out into the stars, we invite these visitors to visit. We have had amazing, and I have to say universally beautiful things happen when we do so. But if someone is convinced that there was a species, some planetary system out there that was against the good human future, the potential of humanity, I would really want to engage with them first. Those are the ones you would want to engage with first from a higher level of consciousness, because let's deconstruct this for just a moment. What other approach is going to be sensible? If we would have destroyed the entire biosphere of the Earth with thermonuclear weapons in the Cold War, the stated policy was mutual assured destruction, then imagine what the technological capabilities are for civilizations that are interstellar and go faster than the speed of light. Well, thermonuclear weapons would look like tinker toys. They would be of no consequence when you're dealing with civilizations that are capable of such technological feats such as interstellar travel. Therefore, the idea that we're going to organize around conflict and war, given such a challenge, is foolishness, number one. And number two, it would not be survivable. And number three, it won't work any more than launching several thousand thermonuclear weapons during the Cold War with the Soviet Union would have worked. All it would have done is turned the planet into a cinder floating through space. So when you go through this analysis, ultimately what we have to do is say, let's make open contact with the intent of creating universal peace in our time. And so I say that to folks who are just completely hanging on to the fact that there has to be out there harmful or evil alien species that are marauding around in our skies and scooping people up out of their beds and what have you. And I think that if that's what you really believe, then you would still want to have this approach. The bottom line is that you would still do what CSETI is doing, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to do sort of a mass training program and contact experiment in Arizona in October. I think it's the 24th, 25th, and 26th of October. And all of you who are listening are invited, and we're going to actually go through. Colin Andrews of Crop Circle fame will be there. I will be there. Dr. Loder will be talking about all the new energy breakthroughs. And Dr. Lynn Katai, who had real personal contact during the Phoenix Lights event, will be speaking. And we're going to do this every night. We're going to be out till midnight, maybe later out under the stars, and making contact and using lasers and also consciousness and meditation and to make contact with these visitors and to also create within the field of awareness the foundation for universal peace into the future, manifesting it right now. And I'm thinking that if we have, 2 or 3 or 400 people in that state of awareness engaged in that, it can have a huge effect, not just on Earth, but throughout the whole cosmos. And what we really are about is this sort of positive change and making a transformation, facilitating the transformation, which is really inevitable at this point. I have no doubt in my mind that where we're headed is that we're headed towards a civilization that will be peaceful. We will have world peace. We will have universal peace. We're going to have these new technologies. And eventually, we will be traveling amongst the stars in peace with these other civilizations that have been certainly guardians of this planet, many of them for thousands, if not millions of years. And so the approach would be the same. And I think that what we have to do, however, as we engage in such an undertaking, is it has to be childhood's end. You can't take at face value. You can sympathize with someone, and certainly Sherry had an experience, Sherry Adamak had an experience like this, and I did also, where you get targeted with one of these terrible astral body extraction technologies and targeted with an abduction. But I knew where it was coming from. There was no question that it was man-made, made to look alien. Now, later, of course, I was able to get, and one of the advantages of being the director of the Disclosure Project worldwide is that I have multiple independent corroborating witnesses on almost any subject you want to imagine, including this one. And that's why we've reached this conclusion that you have to be very careful about reaching conclusions. Our conclusion is that you have to be careful reaching conclusions. You can't say there's no possibility of a threat ever existing because you can't prove a negative. But what you can say is that there's a huge body of evidence showing that a lot of things that pass as contact and as alien abductions is actually a very well-developed, man-made, high-tech program that's a psychological warfare initiative. And this has been known for at least 20 years. I know Martin Cannon's work, I believe, was 1988, and he had put it together before then. There are other people I've talked to who've known about it from way before then, who were involved with it back in the late 50s. And I think that what you have to look at, therefore, is how much of what's being reported to people, quite innocently, I have to say, is real and how much of it is Memorex, something that looks very real but would be designed to be frightening for the psychological response, mainly being that of fear and hatred. And I think this fear and hatred has to be looked at. Who would benefit from that? Who benefits from this kind of conflict? Well, could it be the $1 trillion military-industrial war machine that keeps manufacturing conflict all over the world? Yes. And I think that at their disposal are technologies that would curl your hair. If you think that the best thing that exists within a classified project is a jet engine and a radio transmitter, you're mistaken. I mean, these programs have things that are not inconsequential. They're not trivial. They are extremely well-developed systems and have been since the 50s. And I think this is why when you look at these cases, you have to have sympathy for the victims. I want to be very clear on this. People who have been victimized by these sort of horrific events. But you cannot then extrapolate and conflate actual extraterrestrial interstellar civilizations and put that onto them when it's man-made for some other secret agenda. I think you have to be very fair-minded about this and very just about it. At the same time, I would never deny that there are people who have had terrible and horrifying experiences, because I know they have, because, frankly, I have. And I think that this is something that requires a more mature level of analysis and understanding of who's doing it and why, and who benefits from the fear and the hatred that rises from that fear. And I think that it's very clear who that is. And it's the same cast of characters, this transnational military-industrial cabal, which has been called Majestic, that benefits tremendously from the masses being stampeded into fear. Look what we gave up after 9/11. I mean, the whole Patriot Act and so many things that happened. Our media and the public were completely passive as we invaded Iraq, when Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and it's been proven it hasn't, never mind what Dick Cheney said. So I think that we have to be very careful, because you're dealing with something very explosive here when you start, saying that there are, quote, good and bad aliens out there. Well, now you've gone right down the path of the thousands of years of warfare and conflict and stupidity that has been the bane of human civilization since recorded history. And I think we have to do better than that. I think we have to find a new way of thinking, a new way, and no problem has ever been solved from the level of consciousness that created it. So the consciousness of fear and hatred and division and ignorance isn't going to fix this problem. It's going to be one that's from a much higher level of awareness and understanding, but also a more honest and deep analysis of what's possibly going on out there. One of the things that happened, and I think I've mentioned this to you, Linda, is that in June of 2008, last year,
right, yeah,
a member of our team and I, Ricky Butterfast in Denver, visited Stan Romanek at his home there outside of Denver. And something very interesting was discovered. I had seen that he had been on Larry King Live with this Boo character, that what looked like, a quote, an alien. And I was very interested in what was going on, and a friend of his wanted me to meet with him. And so I went out to his home, and we had a very interesting meeting. And in the course of the meeting, he showed me the videos and the audio tapes of what had been going on. And one of them, there was and he's convinced, is some sort of Air Force intelligence person using a computerized voice that they call Audrey. It sounds like a British woman's voice. Will call his cell phone and give him certain information about an experience he's just had, or warning him about something. And I think this may be because his father was in the Air Force. Stan Romanek's dad was an Air Force career person, I understand. And Stan Romanek has been having a lot of these encounters and strange things happening. Well, one of them, he actually had a camera set up in his kitchen and filmed this strange creature that looks like a gray moving around, and then the camera goes blank. Well, after this event, and he had an abduction experience after that. After this voice called on his cell phone, left a message. It's Audrey. I heard the tape personally, and so did Ricky Butterfast. And it kept saying that was one of the fake ones, and that they threw a chemical canister or sprayed a chemical in your face that caused you to lose consciousness, which is why you dropped the camera and the camera went blank. And no one who was working with Stan Romanek understood what, quote, the fake one meant. And he said, what are they talking about, a fake one? I said, well, Stan, this is a program life form. And I saw the whole video of it. It's classic. And it looks like a classic, quote, gray that people have experienced in these abductions. He said, well, what is that? I said, have you not read anything that we put out there on this? He said, no. I said, oh, my God. I said, well, that was one of the fake ones. That's a man-made alien. It's made to look like an alien. It's not extraterrestrial at all. And his mouth dropped open. He said, well, I've never heard of this. I said, it's because it's suppressed in the UFO and New Age community. You're not allowed to publish or speak, or you will be blacklisted, because it's a huge industry of fear that's selling fear through abductions and mutilations. He says, well, I didn't know that this was even possible, that we had classified projects that had these things. I said, yeah, of course we do, and have had for decades. And that's why this person who's been your sort of protector behind the scenes, not trying to identify who they are using this strange British woman's computer voice, was telling you that's a fake one, and that they had put a chemical in your face that caused you to pass out. And this is classic. This is exactly what happened during the Benowitz affair, by the way, where there was years ago, back in the, 70s or 80s, I have to look at the dates, Paul Benowitz was a UFO researcher, and a woman came to him and said, look, I've been abducted. I had this experience. And it turned out that he was being used to put disinformation out to the UFO community about one of these pseudo-abductions. And there was someone involved named Richard Doty, who's an Air Force officer, special investigation guy. But basically what happened is that a woman was driving near Kirtland Air Force Base in Sandia, outside Albuquerque, and saw something she wasn't supposed to see. And I'm sure it was one of these man-made alien reproduction vehicles. And so she was stopped. Chemical was sprayed in her face. She fell unconscious. She was given this, quote, abduction experience, and then returned later to her vehicle. Now, what's interesting is that it was a very, very old case, but there are many of these. At one point, the executive director for the Intruders Foundation, which was Bud Hopkins' group that was studying all of the abductions, called me up and said, you don't know how right you are. We have so many of these cases where it's clearly the military are involved in staging these abductions, but we can't talk about that. Nobody wants to bring that out. I said, well, why not? It's the truth. He says, well, we can't. He says, I just wanted to let you know you're on the right track. So, there is, I hate to say it, a conspiracy within the UFO and New Age community to not talk about this. And you have to question why that is. But at the same time, my only concern is the truth, creating a better and a peaceful future, and certainly exposing these hoaxes for what they are. And I think that the abduction and mutilation hoaxes, and that's another whole discussion of cattle mutilations. By the way, that's also a paramilitary human operation. And people who don't think that we have the ability surgically and otherwise to do that in classified projects are, again, sadly mistaken. But the point I'm making is that there's a lot of information out there that is disinformation, but there are a lot of people who are unwitting vectors of that disinformation. They don't really know. They're just reporting what someone's telling them, or they're a victim of one of these things. And I'm saying this today on the World Puja Network so that people get a little more depth of understanding of how complex this problem is, and to not jump off into fear and jump off into concluding that we're under some kind of attack by one or more evil extraterrestrial civilizations. There's no evidence of that, frankly. There's a lot of evidence for some hanky-panky going on, I hate to say that, and some deception going on by the intelligence community and by people who would like to create the specter of fear. And I think we have to be careful about that. I think we have to be very cautious about going down that path, because what we don't want to do is trade all the conflict we have on this planet now and unite, as the movie Independence Day suggested, around an alien threat, so that we become united, but we're united in sort of this final Armageddon battle in space with ETs. I think there are certain religious groups who want to see us move in that direction, that are eschatological in nature. They are wanting the end of the world to happen, like Ahmadinejad and a lot of really extreme fundamentalist Orthodox people around the world in different religions. But I also think that we have another problem, and that is this kind of fear is how you control masses of people, and it's also how you get a lot of money that poured into programs. A colonel I spoke with recently, I believe it was this spring, who had been at meetings during the early years of the Ronald Reagan administration, when they were ramping up the SDI, the Star Wars program, told me that the threat from outer space by aliens was one of the things brought up at meetings to try to convince the hundreds of billions of dollars to be put into black budget funding in weaponizing space. So this card has been played over and over and over again, and I think it's like the old song, let's not be fooled again. That we have to be cautious about being deceived, because I view this sort of like the Wizard of Oz phenomenon, where you have this all this frightening sound and fury and stuff going on. You pull the curtain back, and there's this little old man behind the curtain pulling a bunch of levers and scaring the bejeebies out of everybody, out of Dorothy and the lion and the scarecrow and everyone else. And I think that we need to not be manipulated that way on something this important. And I would caution people to think deeply about who would benefit from this kind of fear and conflict, and to consider the fact that when you have an almost unlimited budget within biological sciences, electromagnetic sciences, energy and propulsion systems, and an intent, a clear stated intent, beginning in the early 50s at least, to use this issue for psychological warfare value, what kind of mischief can they make? And I think that's what you have to look at before you reach these sort of Manichaean conclusions of good and bad aliens out there. My own view of it is that I don't think there are any hostile civilizations out there. If there are, I would welcome someone who has the ability or has had contact with them to open contact between the CSETI diplomatic team and them, because those are the folks that you would want to have a dialogue with first if you're sincere about peace. And that's what we're all about. So that's sort of my view on it, and I hope this has clarified things. It's covered a whole lot of very complex issues. So I think in conclusion, I would just encourage people to stay in a positive frame of mind, to question what agendas may really be operating that would be creating this kind of fear and division, and to join us in making contact with these visitors for the purpose of creating a time of universal peace on Earth and in the heavens. And I think that's really what we're about, and I hope all of you can join us in Rio Rico in Arizona in October as we do this mass contact experiment and conference there with Colin Andrews and Dr. Lynn Katai and Dr. Loader. And Linda will be there and is organizing it. And if you have any questions, you can go to CSETI.org/contact, and it has all the information for the conference. And I hope that this is something we can discuss in other shows as well, about how our experiences, almost 20 years going around the world and making peaceful contact, have been nothing but beautiful with these encounters with these extraterrestrial civilizations. Right. And they stand in stark contrast to the sort of fearsome counterintelligence and disinformation that I believe has been manufactured through the use of these, the stagecraft and I think we have to look at that and conclude that caution is needed, and I think that ultimately we need to be in a state of awareness that is a deep cosmic mind that looks at this in the long view of how do we create a transformed world on this planet, space peacefully, and that this is really the big challenge of our era. And it won't happen through fear. It will happen through hope, and it will happen through love, and it will happen through understanding. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and thank you, Linda, for being with me today.
Definitely. You're welcome.
And I'd like to thank the people at the World Puja Network for allowing us this time to discuss these issues with you. This is Dr. Stephen Greer with Conversations with Dr. Greer, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.